Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning and welcome to everyone here this morning. This is day 15 of the hearings on PC7, and the first business this morning is the submission of Waimakariri Irrigation. Mr. Williams. Now, you had another... Sorry.
I had another preliminary matter.
Preliminary matter, yes.
So hopefully on to slightly easier issues. I'm conscious that we've exchanged summaries from all WAL witnesses. Now, that was done in appropriate times, and I'm assuming the panel has read those in detail. I'm in the panel's hands, absolutely, and if you want them to read the summaries, by all means, I will encourage them to do so. What I thought, sir, is perhaps in terms of the witnesses for which there might be a little bit of explanation alongside their summary, you've hopefully received, sir, from Mr. Sanson and Mr. Thomas some PowerPoint slides.
Yes, I think perhaps, would it be helpful if I tell you what I think we've got?
Yep.
And you can tell me if there's something I've overlooked or something I haven't seen that I should have seen.
Yep. And on that note, sir, bear in mind I've got 9 witnesses. What I was proposing to do is when I call each witness, just double check in with the panel, sir, that I have, well, you have the relevant statements in front of you, but if we want to cover off the other documents now, I think that might be useful for all of us, sir.
Excellent. Well, let's start with the submission itself. And there are 2 further submissions as far as I can see. One which is more like an additional submission on some addendum or another, and the other is the classic further submission of the kind we've been talking about, which opposes some other submissions.
Yep, and supports some others. Yes, so there's I think the former you're referring to, sir, is the further submission on the second addendum, for want of a better description. So there was a re-notification of the summary of submissions, which then resulted in, I'm assuming, a limited number of further submissions being provided by various submitters, and this is one of them. So that's the 31 January 2020 submission, and the further submission before that being 6 December 2019.
So we're just checking that we both know what the other has.
Yep.
Then we have, as you say, a number of evidence statements. Mike Copeland, evidence achieved, rebuttal and summary.
Yep, 3 documents for Mr. Copeland.
Laura Drummond, evidence and an additional or summary statement.
Yep.
Stuart Ford, evidence, rebuttal and an additional statement.
Yes, sir.
Paul Rees, evidence and an additional summary.
Yes, sir.
Jeremy Sanson, the same.
And you should also, sir, have a PowerPoint, which I guess forms part of the summary, sir, but it is a separate document from Mr. Sanson.
Yes. And Bianca Sullivan, evidence, rebuttal and summary.
Yes, sir.
Which is, as a summary, is also, in her case, I think, an updating.
Yeah.
Which is very, very appropriate.
Yeah.
Brent Walton, evidence and summary.
And just consistent with your previous comments, confirming, sir, that his summary also provides an update on the storage aspect, so it is partial update, again, appropriate in the circumstances, sir.
Very good. Neil Thomas, evidence, rebuttal, and summary and presentation.
Yep, so a presentation or PowerPoint, yep.
David Black, rebuttal and summary.
Yes, sir.
And legal submissions.
And legal submissions. So on that basis, I understand you have everything I have, so that's pleasing, sir. So.
That's good to be checked. So I can tell you, and my colleagues will acknowledge the same, that we have read all of that, all of those things, and we thank you for them, and we thank you for providing them in advance so that it matches our hopes for fairness.
No, that's appreciated, sir. Thank you.
So we don't really need any of them to read them to us, but we're in your hands as to whether you want them to read some of the summary or those to have PowerPoints. Of course, you can have them show us the PowerPoints again.
No, sir, I'm not proposing to have any of them read the summaries, and I certainly appreciate the panel has spent a lot of time reading these carefully.
Oh, it's an important case.
Absolutely. I will get Mr. Sanson and Mr. Thomas to briefly talk to their PowerPoints because although there are some cross-references to their summaries, I think it might help for contextual clarity if you at least have them talk through the presentations so you can understand exactly the points being made. But again, in your hands, and if you want them to expand on points or, to be blunt, hurry up on any points, feel free to tell them to do so. So similarly with the legal, sorry.
We may well have some questions
Yeah.
for at least some of the witnesses.
I'm proposing to call them all up, sir, on the basis that you will most likely, or the three commissioners will have questions or clarification or expansion in respect of issues raised. And equally with my legal submissions, I'm not proposing to read them. They have been provided in advance, obviously. I do apologise, they are a wee bit lengthy given the timetabling and the fact you've had to read other summaries in the time available, but I hope they summarise the issues reasonably well. I, again, wasn't proposing to expand on any points in any great detail, but I thought I might just spend 5 minutes just going through a few key themes, if that's okay with you, sir.
It's certainly okay, however you want to do it, so long as it's within the general scope of
Absolutely, sir.
People have been entitled to expect would be happening today.
Yeah. So,
and you can decide the order in which things happen, and you can either give your legal submissions first or speak to them, or you can leave them till last, whichever you prefer. And the order in which the witnesses come can suit them as much as anyone else.
To give a heads up to the panel in terms of order, in paragraph 80 of the legal submissions, that paragraph sets out the 9 witnesses WAL is calling. I was proposing to call them in the order set out, so that may assist the panel in terms of at least knowing what pile of paper or electronic folder or whatever they're looking at, read the order of witnesses. So that would be Mr. Walton first.
Just a moment then. I'm sorry, I just opened the Waimakariri District Council's file instead of yours. Now, you were referring to a particular page in your legal
So
submissions?
paragraph 18 or paragraph 80, sir, it's got the order of witnesses, which is, again, unless the panel wants to hear them in a different order, but this was the order I was proposing to call them in, sir. So if it assists in terms of giving you a heads up in terms of who's next, my proposed order is set out there, sir. So.
Well, something's odd. Did you say paragraph 18?
80, sir. Page 18.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right, sir.
Beg your pardon. Ah, yes.
So that's the order proposed, sir. I may come back, I think, probably at the end in terms of a couple of more nuanced legal issues. In terms of a very brief high-level overview, this PC7 has obviously been of considerable interest and concern to Waimakariri Irrigation Ltd. So the schemes historically, as hopefully evidence, being a proactive and early mover in terms of environmental management. So it was the first scheme, or one of the first schemes, to get a nutrient discharge consent, and it's had very detailed nutrient management policies in play for quite a long period of time. So it's taken the issues of nutrient management very responsibly, and that responsibility has extended into this process. There's certainly a lot of worry amongst the WAL shareholders re what the future holds for them. But equally, WAL is supportive of the long-term water quality outcomes sought. And after a lot of effort being put in and considerable expert evidence being obtained, I think the position being put forward by WAL, at least in the short to medium term, is relatively consistent with the notified version of PC7. And I think the crux of the issue, sir, is ensuring the regime that's ultimately made operative through this PC7 process does continue to enable WAL to give effect to that responsible approach it's historically taken. And that includes, for example, being in the best position possible to give effect to its storage proposal. Now that remains subject to shareholder support, but equally obtaining that support is going to be considerably easier should PC7 set a pathway for farming in the district that enables outcomes to be met and ultimately other activities such as managed aquifer recharge and targeted stream augmentation to occur. There's very, very much a sentiment amongst the shareholders, sir, and the WAL board of we all need to be in this together. And without that, sir, I think the support that can be provided to achieving of the environmental outcomes from the scheme is imperilled. So the crux of the case, sir, is that Table 8.9 is reduced to having reductions at 2030 and reductions at 2040 potentially being accommodated should monitoring, hopefully by which stage there's sufficient certainty at the next plan review, suggest those reductions are required. Much of the WAL case also focuses on the uncertainties with the modelling. And to put the position simply, the expert evidence called by WAL struggles with aligning the modelled outcomes with the available measured data. That's not to say the model is necessarily fundamentally completely wrong. It's simply we don't have enough information in front of us to make an informed decision on what the long-term environment and appropriate planning response needs to be. So on the one hand, we've got the model or an outcome from the model informing a planning approach versus the existing environment. And this is not shying away, sir, at all around the importance of achieving long-term water quality and quantity outcomes. But an existing environment that has a median nitrate-nitrogen concentration of around 3.1 milligrams across the zone and relatively stable groundwater nitrate N concentrations over the last 3 decades. So it's certainly acknowledged there are some localised water quality issues, but WAL is left questioning whether the modelling approach is the best means of achieving those outcomes, or whether the better approach is to provide for some reductions in the, perhaps shouldn't refer to as 10 years as short term, but in the short to medium term, being a 2030 and 2040 potential reduction horizon, and then better enabling not only WAL but ultimately the wider community to get on, own the water quality issues and water quantity issues and give effect to the outcome sought. So that's probably all I need to say in terms of very high level introduction. I may come back at the end in terms of a couple more detailed points if they don't come out in evidence presentations in and of themselves. I'm happy to take questions now, or perhaps more appropriately at the end on some of those more esoteric legal issues.
Well, I think I'll leave you to say what you prefer in terms of it, but don't omit, if we leave it till later, don't omit to give me the opportunity, because it's part of the process that we will understand better if any questions that come to our mind are addressed.
Yeah, perhaps, and I'm in the panel's hands again, if the panel does have questions around the original submission or further submission and those high-level themes or the relief being sought, perhaps it's appropriate to ask those now, because they might well inform the approach to or answers to questions from the witnesses in due course. Equally, if there are particular legal issues that the panel wants to explore with me, I'm quite happy for those to be left at the end. Or left for the end.
So I'll ask Commissioner Van Voorthuizen if he has any questions that he wishes to ask at this stage of Council for Waimakariri Irrigation concerning their submission and legal submissions.
Yes, thank you. Just 2 questions arising from the pre-circulated legal submissions. The first question at paragraph 7. And you say there that PC7 must give effect to the MPS FM 2017. And I'm just asking if that's correct, because we now have an MPS FM 2020 on page 2 of that document.
No,
it says
that's... So I'll just make sure the context is... No, apologies, sir, that reference should be to the 2020 NPS FM, which I've obviously discussed in detail later in the submissions.
Okay, no, thanks for clarifying that. And the second question arises at your paragraph 39. PC7 proposes to set a limit which is half of the MAV for aquifers in the Waimak district, and I understand where that is that's in tables 8-7, I think. And then it goes on to say, though, and 1/3 of the MAV for the Christchurch aquifers, and I couldn't find where in PC7 it sets a limit of 1/3 of the MAV for the Christchurch aquifers.
And that may need to be reworded, sir, or the brackets have not properly articulated, which is the intent. So PC7 doesn't set anything for the Christchurch aquifers. I think that was more intended as a comparative, sir. So.
Yeah, Okay. Right, thank you. They're the only two matters I wish to ask you about.
Commissioner Sullivan.
No, no questions from me, thank you.
Could we just go, while we've got the legal submissions in front of us, could we just go to paragraph 47? Because I think that this might be a simple answer that I just don't anticipate. You tell us there after, but before you actually refer to Dr. Chambers, the hearing panel does not have before it comprehensive expertise on this issue. Now, I wonder whether you're aware of the evidence that was given by Dr. Alistair Humphreys, Medical Officer of Health, in a previous hearing week in response to a question from the bench.
No, I'm not. So did he, just for my own clarification, did he provide further information in response to a question? I haven't, if that is the case, I haven't seen the response to his question.
Well, it's important that you should know that I think we have some evidence from Dr. Humphreys on the subject, because you obviously thought that we didn't. And I asked a question or two of Dr. Humphreys, who was there for some other purpose, but we know him well, of course. And I thought that he may be able to assist us with an understanding of something about how the drinking water standards work. And somehow or other, the exchange got into this question of colorectal cancer, and he gave us some evidence which, acknowledging his expertise, is worthy of mention.
Again, I can't comment on its contents, sir. I certainly accept that my paragraph 47 may need to be expanded out to make reference to Dr. Humphrey's response. So, I will ask that Dr. Black look at Dr. Humphrey's evidence, and if there are any particular comments, sir, I may make an application on the appropriate notice.
Of course you may.
Yeah,
yes,
to provide a further response to that.
Of course, you may help us over that. It's an important issue. Yeah. And we can do with all the help we can get.
That's right, and I think this is not, PC7 is grappling with this issue as well, but this is not only a New Zealand-wide issue, but to some extent a global issue. And it is a complex area with seemingly no clear position at the moment, and certainly Dr. Black has expanded on this a lot in terms of what that means for actually setting standards and the approach to a regulatory regime. So I appreciate that.
Yes, I have read Dr. Black's evidence and also the other man, Dr. Chambers.
Yeah. No, so, thank you.
There's another little point, and this is an even impressive point, but if you go to paragraph 28, in the second sentence, you say the courts have consistently recognised that a precautionary approach is inherent. And I'm wondering about the word consistently. Is it your submission that there are no court decisions that reject the use of precaution in the particular case?
I think the word consistently might be better worded on the basis of the courts. A number of court decisions have recognised that a precautionary approach is inherent in the Act's provisions.
Yes, well, of course I acknowledge that immediately. It was just this extra parameter of consistently, which implies that there's no cases going the other way. And I didn't think that was...
No, that's correct, sir. I think the word, as my rewording is probably more appropriate, sir. Certainly in my submission there is a clear approach increasingly being articulated by all levels of courts in respect to this issue, which is consistent, I think. I hate to use that word again, but it is consistent with the general submission of my submission, sir, that the RMA already has a number of aspects to it which are precautionary in nature.
Yes, well, I understand that submission, and I don't need to ask you about that further. I have no further question about your legal submissions. I don't think colleagues have. I have some questions that relate to the original submission itself, and I'm wondering whether you'd like to proceed to them now, or are they the ones that you would prefer we left until after the evidence?
I'm happy to proceed to them now, sir, just with one caveat. I'm obviously calling Ms Sullivan as a planner, and should there be particular planning-related questions or questions that relate to how these points have been brought through to her evidence, I would obviously defer to her, but I'm happy to run through the questions now, sir.
All right, well, let's do that, because I hadn't thought that there was any question I wanted to ask of Ms Sullivan.
Okay.
Because I thought that the questions I wanted to ask might be questions that you would think that you should be answering.
Okay, I'll certainly take your lead on that, sir.
All right. Well, if we go to the original submission, page 7, which
yes.
I can't immediately get to, but in paragraph 11, I think the submission, yes, am I right?
Is it page 6 is paragraph 11?
Ah, it could be. You know what happens? When you're typing the original, you have a particular pagination.
Yeah.
Then when it gets converted into a PDF and so forth, you get a different pagination. And so the page number can easily be run out.
Yep. No, I'm certainly well aware of that, sir.
Page 6, paragraph 11, is that where the submitter, Waimakariri Irrigation, asks that an appropriate balance should be struck between making reductions in nutrient losses over time and continuing farming?
That's what I read paragraph 11 to be, sir. So.
That's the context then of my question, which is, that was a very understandable submission to make at the time that was lodged. But we're now under a new regime, the NPS 20, which has an obligatory hierarchy of priorities. So my question is, can a regional council any longer be managing fresh water by a balance between those factors? Or is it obliged to give the health and well-being of water bodies and freshwater ecosystems first priority over economic well-being as a third priority? And I think that there's something in your submissions, your legal submissions, that might agree with that, but I just thought I should ask you directly to be fair.
Yeah, no, that's a fair comment, sir, and just for completeness, I know Ms Sullivan has also expanded on this point in her summary, and I think the general proposition is the NPSM FM 2020, as I should refer to it as, has changed the playing field to some extent, but the difficulty is, sir, to the extent that the implementation of the single objective set out in the NPSFM is reliant on Te Mana OTY, then there is obviously a lengthy and comprehensive, not only substantive process, but procedural process that needs to be gone through to give effect to Te Mana OTY at a local level, which this hearing panel unfortunately doesn't have in front of it. So I certainly accept at a conceptual level, and it's a difficulty this hearing panel faces and a difficulty this other hearing panels will face in other places as well. The priorities are relevant to your decision-making process, but exactly what they mean at a localised level is quite hard, and more generally, and I've obviously spent a lot of time on this in legal submissions, and Ms Sullivan has covered off as well. We see the WAL solutions package as being consistent with the achievement of the objective, so we're not shying away from the need to achieve appropriate environmental outcomes, water quality and quantity. That is absolutely accepted.
That's well understood. It's clear. Well, now, thank you for that. In that paragraphs 11 to 13, Waimakariri Irrigation submits that decisions should be made for achieving the purpose of the RMA. My question that comes to my mind, and you might help me with, is does any of the three classes of exception identified in King Salmon apply to relieve a regional council from the default obligation to give effect to the NPS FM 20 to the exclusion of specific matters in Part 2 of the RMA?
Can I come back to you on that point, sir, either at the end or in reply? That's actually quite a complicated question.
Yes, and it's a question that I'm deliberately asking.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
Because I think I have to think about it.
Yeah.
So I'm entitled to give you the understanding that I'm thinking about it. So if you want to help me think about it, well,
yeah,
you have the chance.
Yeah, I'll come back to you on that point, sir.
Reserved, that's fine. Now, consent durations. Concerning policies 84, 35, at least 36 and 37, your submission says that in some cases, or in some circumstances, longer consent durations may be appropriate. So it asks that these policies are deleted or amended as for large-scale infrastructure. So that's the context of the question. I have it in mind that major changes to environmental and legal conditions may be expected over the next decade. Examples: the interpretation and application of the NPS FM 20, climate change and its effects on Canterbury. And a third example might be the likely replacement of the RMA. So my question in my mind is, would those expectations of major changes over the next decade be indicative of shorter consent durations so that replacement consents might be considered against the changed circumstances then applying?
I certainly accept, sir, there is a lot of regulatory uncertainty going forward, and the examples you gave on that, sir, are very good ones around that. As I see it, sir, particularly as we currently sit over the next 5 years or 4 years, if we reference the 2024 NPSFM date, there's a lot more to happen in terms of the planning framework. In that context, and looking at the WAL scheme in isolation, its current consents run out to 2025, so by the time it comes round for consent renewal, the playing field is perhaps a bit clearer, in which case, should it wish to... Sorry?
Good luck with that.
Yes, I know. I guess in cutting to the chase, sir, we don't know what we don't know. At the relevant time, WAL or any other applicant comes up in for renewal, what the position will look like. But I see no reason why the Section 4 default regime of possibly, and it's no assurances, a longer duration would be provided. I certainly accept that, sir, but the Section 4 approach, or LWRP, Section 4 I'm referring to there,
yes,
of at least enabling applicants to put a case for a longer duration should stand, but equally I fully accept sitting here in 2020 that there might well be a number of reasons that the Regional Council looks to err on the side of shorter durations as opposed to long durations. And within that, we'll obviously be mindful of also integrating whatever duration it reaches with the reviews of this plan, the LWRP and Section 8 for that matter as well.
Well, thank you for that answer. The second part of, or the second question arising in the same issue is the interesting comparison that you're inviting with large-scale infrastructure. And I'm interested in the concept, but I'm not persuaded at this stage. But I thought I should give you the opportunity to expand. Is the comparison one of having equivalent skin in the game, if I can use that vernacular, or is it just that they've got that, so we like it too? Or what is there that is in principle a basis for saying we should have the same as large-scale infrastructure?
I've always regarded irrigation schemes as large-scale infrastructure for a number of reasons. So obviously geographic coverage is probably the primary one in the case of an irrigation scheme, so it's set in evidence, but the WAL scheme covers in excess of 20,000 hectares and has an extensive conveyance network. In the future, the WAL scheme may also be complemented by large-scale scheme-wide storage. And adjunct to those are identifiable district and regional social, economic and cultural benefits that accrue from the schemes.
Well, thank you. In that Waimakariri Irrigation submits that longer term restrictions, like beyond 2030 or at least beyond 2040, are not justified and too costly because data is incomplete. Is the Regional Council obliged by clause 1.6 of the NPS FM 20 to take action as soon as practical, and that times for achieving goals are to be ambitious, though reasonable?
I certainly accept, sir, that 1.6 of the NPS FM does require the Regional Council to take action, but within that, sir, the expectation is that those decisions will be made on the basis of the best available information. And although reliance on modelled outcomes might well be necessary in some circumstances, it's certainly WAL's case that that is merely a point in time, and come further plan reviews and further monitoring, the best available information hopefully improves and more informed and robust decisions can be made. And again, WAL is not shying away from the achievement of those long-term, or not whatever timeframes attached to them, to the water quality and water quantity outcomes sought. We're fully accepting, for example, of the proposed groundwater nitrate nitrogen limit and propose that that be included now. What the WAL case is about is enabling the WAL scheme, and for that matter the wider farming community, to give effect to those outcomes in a different manner, in the hope, if anything, they might well be achieved sooner.
Well, certainly to the extent that the WAL case is constructive, that's entirely welcomed, of course. That's what the process should be doing. But is it capable of being useful to stakeholders, which might include WIL and the shareholders, to know what regulatory expectations they might need to be working under for a period beyond, say, 2030? As best they can be assessed now, without precluding later revision by appropriate process.
So in my submission, sir, the identification of the example I gave, and there are others, of the nitrate nitrogen groundwater concentration in the plan now, and the policy provision that is proposed to be bolstered re further monitoring and other work being undertaken to ensure those outcomes is met, is in my submission consistent with 1.6. So I think the farming community more generally, or the WAL scheme, should, if the WAL relief package is accepted, be abundantly clear that the water quantity and quality outcomes need to be achieved, and that might well comprise of reductions that are foreshadowed now, with a horizon of 2030 or potentially extending out to 2040, as you noted, and then clear expectations that those will be looked at again. Certainly it's the scheme's hope that MAR and TSA and the other means proposed are successful and or the model is proven to not align with actual data. But certainly beyond 2040, it's accepted that there is a scenario where a future plan review determines that things may need to be looked at again, and I think that's accepted by the farming community as it stands at the moment. I certainly want to make it clear, sir, that there's no suggestion that, for example, 2030 is the end of it for if you're in a blue zone. It might well be that this is going to be an ongoing process with the overall outcome being sought, being the achievement of those water quality nitrate nitrogen limits, for example, being, if you like, locked in stone, and a package of measures put in place now in line with 1.6.
Well, thank you. Now, in clause 16, and I think this might be 1614 and 1619 and round about there, there's a, and I'm summarizing, I hope fairly, the company is submitting that farmers are being held fully accountable for requiring nutrient reductions, and other catchments have been treated less restrictively. Now, I take it that's a fair summary, is it, of what WIL is saying? They think they're being treated unfairly?
No, I don't think the suggestion, sir, is they're being treated unfairly. I think those paragraphs were intended to draw a comparison with the Hines Plains process, yes, whereby, which is not dissimilar to here, there, in some respects, albeit water quality, actual data available down there is perhaps what was ultimately used to determine the planning regime. So in the Hines Plains context, there was an expectation that nitrate nitrogen was well in excess of appropriate levels, considerably in excess of what's occurring in the Waimakariri zone. And the similarly comprised or identically comprised hearing panel there, I can't quite remember, apologies,
I think we're here.
determined that although although a 45% reduction in total nitrate nitrogen load was required to meet the desired catchment outcomes, the policy 13.4.13 that was reached there proposes that 36% be borne by the farming community, with the balance to be made up by managed aquifer recharge, targeted stream augmentation and other measures. So the comparison set out in my 1614 to 1618-ish was ready to demonstrate that's consistent with the WIL solutions package that's now being proposed here, i.e. there's a full acceptance that some reductions will need to be borne by the farming community now, but equally we want the support and policy provision being made to enable MAR and TSA, if I can refer to them by their acronyms, to make up the difference, if you like, sir.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I asked that, because I think I had not got a clear understanding that you were looking to MAR and TSA for your answer, as happened in Hines.
So again, there's no shying away from the need to achieve the proposed or notified proposed long-term water quality and quantity outcomes in the PC7 context. It's the means by which they are being achieved, which is the most interest of WIL. The scheme thinks the more appropriate approach is to take some of the burden, so accept some reductions out to 2030 and potentially 2040, but equally enable the schemes in the wider community to give effect to MAR and TSA and other measures. And I think more pertinently in the PC7 Section 8 context, ground truth, the groundwater model, for which there are a lot of questions.
Yes. Well, at this stage in our process, it's important that we have our minds open to the cases of all submitters. Now, we know that WIL opposes the Christchurch City Council case, and we know that the Christchurch City Council opposes the WIL case. And of course, we're not in a position at this stage to have any feel for which might prevail or whether it's got to be one or the other. But if the Christchurch City Council's position prevailed, would that justify, in the NPS FM 20 context, expecting full accountability for contamination of fresh water in the Waimak catchment to fall on the Waimak catchment rather than the City Council?
I'll give a short answer to that question to start with. I don't think the CCC case is supported by the NPS FM 2020. It is going far, far beyond, in my submission, what the NPS FM 2020 might anticipate. I also come back, sir, to the general proposition that the RMA is not a no-effects statute, and equally the NPS FM 2020, although I certainly accept, as I've accepted in previous questions, that it now places a different emphasis or a priority in terms of the achievement of outcomes, it still does seek to give effect to, amongst other things, and this is obviously express policy recognition of this, against that prioritisation of economic, social and cultural outcomes, for example.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Does either of my colleagues have any further questions of Mr. Williams at this stage, or have we reached the stage where we might take a morning break?
No questions from me.
Yes.
Nor from me. Nor from me. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we've reached the time when we could take a morning break, and we'll start again in a quarter of an hour. Well, Mr. Williams, you may proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, sir. I have to move to another microphone. So I've now got Mr. Walton as per my paragraph 80. Here's the first witness been called by WIL, and as per our previous discussion, I'm proposing that he doesn't read a summary and we just jump straight to questions should the panel have any.
Well, good morning, Mr. Bolton. Thank you for coming. We welcome you, and thank you for the evidence and the summary that you've presented to us. Is there anything further you were wanting to say before we come to any questions?
No, just thank you for giving us the opportunity. This is quite important to our shareholders in the future, equally. So the outcomes that are sought for PC7 and water quality issues.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, it's an important industry as well.
yes.
So any questions, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Your paragraph 35.1 on the bottom of your page 5. And you refer there to the way that you calculate nitrogen losses for the shareholders and the MRB methodology. Is that also known as the matrix method?
I believe the matrix method's morphed from this.
Right. Has the Canterbury Regional Council approved the use of the matrix method for Waimakariri Irrigation Ltd?
They've certainly approved the MRB method. So we were issued a consent in 2016 and again in 2018 based on the MRB tables.
Why I asked that particular question is I noted in Ms Sullivan's evidence she refers to the matrix method and ECAN's chief executive approving it for mid-Canterbury irrigation schemes. That's her paragraph 47, but in her footnote, your scheme's not one of the ones that she lists.
Yeah, if I can. So you're quite correct, sir. The matrix method has not been approved for the Waimakariri irrigation scheme. It has been approved for 3 mid-Canterbury irrigation schemes, Bartle Chertsey, MHV Water and Ashburn and Lyndhurst Irrigation Limited. Mr Sanson sets this out in his evidence with the expectation being that the matrix method would need to be recalibrated for the Waimakariri zone and further approval of the Chief Executive sought. So the relief sought is simply wanting some provision to be made or flexibility in terms of being able to seek such approvals. It's not in any way suggesting that the matrix method as currently proposed is suitable for the Waimakariri area.
Okay. All right, no, thanks for that. The other issue I wanted to ask you about was, I think in your evidence and others, that you say that the individual shareholders aren't told what their nitrogen loss is. I'm sort of putting that into lay terms based on my understanding of the evidence. I'm a bit confused by that because in the policy document attached to your evidence as your Appendix 4, it states that each shareholder has to do an overseer budget annually, so they must know what their nitrogen loss is. So can you help me understand that?
There's 2 aspects to that. When we went for our original discharge consent, we didn't have overseer files available for all the farms. So
yep.
Given that that was 2015 when we started that process, so a number of years at that point had elapsed. So we adopted the MRB files in the absence of having hard data. Going forward, recognising the importance of this, the farmers do overseer reports. So we have them in current state, but farmers didn't have records of them 2009 to 2013, just simply because it wasn't a priority back in those days or a requirement.
Right. So each shareholder farmer would now know what their nitrogen loss is, though.
They'd have a reasonably good understanding of
based on their annual nutrient budget that they're obliged to do under the nutrient management policy. Okay. All right. No, that was all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Sullivan?
Yes, I just have several questions for Mr Walton. At paragraph 13 in your evidence summary, you again refer to the Wrights Road storage ponds whereby the final conditions of consent have been resolved. Is the storage ponds being constructed primarily to provide water for managed aquifer recharge, or is it for irrigation as well?
No, so right from the outset, the scheme recognised that reliability was important. As the years have gone by, that's become more apparent. So it was really about addressing reliability. So the run of the river is currently 72%, and the storage will take it up to 90%. So the primary focus with storage back from its inception was to address the issues of reliability. As time's gone on and times change and requirements change, that storage will also support MAR and TSA.
Okay. And I'm talking about your evidence in chief now, at paragraphs 50 to 53. You talk about MAR reducing nitrates, but does it reduce nitrates or does it just dilute concentrations?
It'll act as a dilution effect.
Okay. And again, regarding MAR, have you given any thoughts to how you might address Te Waimakariri's concerns about mixing one water type with another?
Yes, we have, and that will be through an infiltration process. So we've had discussions, particularly about TSA. We'll go through an intermediary wetland.
Okay.
And also, I guess MAR is informally goes through a filtering process anyway. But that's how we would address those.
And have you given any thoughts or considered Mr Fenwick's concerns about mixing one water type with another because of stygofauna found in particular and unique to each water body?
You'd have to ask our technical witnesses for that, sorry.
I will ask them. And I've read through the forest and bird evidence, and at their paragraph 55, they suggest, amongst other things, that MAR and TSA encourage abdication from pollution responsibilities, encourage further intensification of land use, encourage continued over-allocation, do not support best management practices. What would your response be to these comments?
Don't support those one little bit. So MAR and TSA are part of our solutions package. We certainly aren't ignoring what's required on farm, and massive effort's been done well before this process even started to start considering managing to limits. We implemented farm plans, whole management regime about improving environmental outcomes through that process. So that's occurring in one area there. We're looking at MAR and TSA as part of that solution to address those water quality issues sooner than might otherwise occur through other options. Through the entire history of well, we've never walked away from our responsibility of trying to improve outcomes. So, certainly don't support those comments.
So how can the local and wider community be reassured that reducing nutrient inputs by undertaking practical good management practices on the ground will continue and not be left to MAR and TSA to dilute concentrations? So I'm thinking of the wider community, not the local community.
So in terms of having to meet the reductions out to 2030 and possibly 2040, we're already well on that journey of achieving those outcomes. And I think we've got consents that have quite stringent conditions in, and you'll see at the back of my evidence that we report annually on those. So even if we turned around and decided, right, let's follow that line of thought and not take any actions, we'd pretty quickly come unstuck in November when we came to report and going, we'd be quickly non-compliant and we'd lose those consents, drop of a hat.
Thank you, that's all from me.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bolton. Thank you for your evidence and thank you for the interesting and important submission.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll now turn to Mr. Copeland.
Ask them.
And again, proposing we approach his evidence on the same basis, sir, so no presentation, and move straight to questions.
Good morning, Mr. Copeland, again.
Good morning.
We have read your original submission, at least the evidence statement, and we thank you also for the summary that you produced for us recently. We may still have some questions to ask of you. And is there any correction or updating that you need to do before we come to that?
No, sir.
Very good. Well, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, do you have questions of Mr. Copeland?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No questions, thank you.
I'm either irrelevant or very clear.
Mr. Copeland, we're talking about people who might be purchasing dairy farms or might have been purchasing dairy farms or perhaps converting to dairy and perhaps incurring debt for that purpose over a period of, 12 or 15 years. Would it have been the normal practice for people in those positions to do systematic due diligence about the expectable risks of their business?
I would suggest that they would, sir, as would their bank managers.
Yes, I think so. And would that include considering risks of regulatory restrictions in respect of environmental issues being addressed in national policies?
Yes, sir. I don't
Couldn't
want to.
avoid it, could they?
Sorry?
They couldn't really avoid doing that, could they?
No. I mean, there'll be others after me, perhaps better able to comment, but I think we're all aware that with the passage of time, those risks have perhaps been higher now than they were, as you suggested, 15 or 20 years ago.
Yes, well, I think these national policies have been about for 10 or 15 years now, haven't they?
Yes.
So here's another way I was thinking about it. You might be able to comment. Would any operator of a dairy farm annually review a business plan?
I'm not a dairy farmer, but I suspect they may do it annually or more regularly or less regularly.
Yes. And would that be likely to include contingency allowances for regulatory risks?
They may do, formally or informally.
It would be part of a credible business plan, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Now, just as a very experienced economist, do economists assume that for a current proposal that you might be considering, the business environment would continue unchanged for decades?
No, but an economist works out different economists will do it different ways, but if I was doing a cost-benefit analysis of an irrigation project for the Asian Development Bank, I would plug into my analysis what I consider to be expected values. Another way of expressing that would be the most likely to occur on the basis of my current knowledge. And then I would be required to do what we call sensitivity testing, where we would vary various assumptions, plus or minus 10% or plus or minus 20%, depending on how well we felt we'd evaluated the costs and the benefits, and see to what extent the outcome changes with a change in major assumptions. But by necessity, that always has to be done on the basis of current knowledge and allowing for pluses and minuses beyond our current knowledge.
So you wouldn't be making an assumption that the business conditions would continue unchanged over a period even of 10 years, would you?
No, but as I said, I'd always want to be doing what I consider to be the expected values, and you could be more sophisticated than that and take your values and apply probability weights and all the rest of it. But some people would be very conservative and take the worst case assumptions to guide them. Other people would probably be optimists, half glass full people or whatever. They might take the best outcome and run closer to the line. But there was always going to be an element of risk. So even if you had unlimited budget, you can spend more money to reduce uncertainty, but I don't think you can eliminate it.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Copeland, for those additional pieces of evidence for us. We're grateful for all of your contributions in the past as well as the present. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, and we'll now move to Dr. Black.
Thank you.
And again, approaching his evidence on the same basis, so move straight to questions.
Thank you. Questions for Dr. Black? Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Just one question. It's from your summary statement, paragraph 6.
Yes.
And in that paragraph, second to last line, you say that that view is no more than speculative and not widely accepted. I was just wondering the basis for your not widely accepted opinion.
Well, the not widely expected, Commissioner, refers to the suggestion that ingested nitrate could be linked to causality for cancer. That is speculative in the sense that although there are some studies showing an apparent association, the level of the level of a test such as the Bradford-Hill criteria do not meet the requirements for causality. There's a difference in epidemiology between association and causality. There are some in the paper which I have referred to, the paper I have seen, there are some very good studies referred to, particularly the Danish study, and it certainly is an area of current scientific interest, but at the moment the link in terms of causality is no more than speculation.
Yeah, sorry, I understand all of that. I should have asked a better question. So when you say that Dr. Chambers' view is not widely accepted, is that based on, for instance, discussions you've had with colleagues, your involvement in national or international working groups, your review of research papers? What's your conclusion based on?
It's not based on any work that I have done. I have not worked in this area, so I'm not part of any working groups. I was asked to look at this issue from the point of view of application to standard setting, which is an area in which I have got a lot of experience, and it is based on my review of the current literature, including and further than the papers referred to by Dr. Chambers.
Okay, that's good. That's clarified that for me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have one question for Mr. Black. And again, it has your evidence on paragraph 6. You would have read Mr. Chambers' evidence at his paragraph 4 where he says who are historically slow to act. And he gives the example of COVID lockdown and whose response to that. And even I can remember they were slow to act. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, I do, Commissioner. I've been involved with the World Health Organization for a long time on a lot of matters. And the organisation does have to be very certain before it gives advice. I don't regard them as any slower to act than they need to be. They are
conservative in their advice, and they don't issue advice which then become international directives until they're sure. I don't think, I've had quite a lot to do with COVID in my role as a clinician in Auckland. I don't think they were slow to act, but it's certainly true that our New Zealand epidemiologists were probably ahead of them, but then we're also advising them. I have, having been involved in a lot of work with WHO, I hold them in very high regard.
No, I didn't mean to give the impression that Dr. Chambers doesn't, because he does too.
No, I understand that.
But obviously this is an emerging science that's still to be concluded.
Yes.
Thank you. No more questions from me.
Thank you.
Might I start, Dr. Black, with what will be a very elementary point for you, but I'm just trying to get a hang of these drinking water standards. Now, we have this 11.3 milligrams per litre MAV
Yes.
in the standard. Was that set at a level below which no bottle-fed infant would be at risk of this long word, metho something or other? Or is it more a statistical measure, such as, for example, 90% of such infants would not be at risk?
You're correct, Your Honour. It is, in fact, a statistical measure. I don't think it attempts to provide perfection in that regard. On the other hand, the whole issue of that relationship does, in some minds, remain controversial in terms of cause and effect, but it is too significant to ignore, and so that level was set as I understand it, as an achievable level, which should prevent most of the problem, but it is not claimed to be perfection, as I understand it.
Thank you very much for that. So, at what concentration, if any, is nitrate nitrogen in drinking water harmful to people other than bottle-fed infants?
Well, the WHO position was to provide the limitation of 50 milligrams per litre as a MAV, but that was intended to be conservative. The actual level of being harmful would be well above that, depending on what the harm might be. Then that, of course, is not, or has not in the past been regarded as cancer. The ECNIRP 2005 based work, it's a 2010, sorry, I said ECNIRP, I mean IARC, I'll just correct that, IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer document published in 2010 is based on 2005 publications, so it's quite a long time ago, and it doesn't regard cancer causation as a factor to take into account in setting that standard. So to answer Your Honour's question, much higher than 50 milligrams per litre.
Right, thank you. Now, I want to ask a question or two about the potential review of the New Zealand drinking water standard.
So,
can you tell me, have the health authorities made a decision positively that they will review this drinking water standard?
I understand so, Your Honour. I haven't been directly involved with that myself, but I'm quite clear from my colleagues that a decision has been made, triggered mostly by concerns about microbiological contamination, which is, of course, the big risk in New Zealand, and as happened in the Hawke's Bay. That, of course, is what happened there was of huge concern. And my understanding is that a working committee has been established by the Ministry of Health, no doubt held up by COVID, which will review the drinking water standard for New Zealand. The current standard was 2005, so that predates the IARC report, and then it was revised in 2018.
So do you know if the ministry or this committee that you speak of had decided to review the nitrate measures?
I don't know that for certain, sir, but I am aware that some members of that committee have strong views on that matter, and I would be, given the existence of literature such as that referred to by Dr. Chambers, which is in the mainstream literature, and some of those papers are of high quality, I could not imagine that they would not. A literature search on considerations for drinking water standards would definitely include that. Whether, of course, that literature would result in any change in standard is completely another matter, because the papers which do exist, which I have looked at, do indicate an issue worthy of investigation, but the issue of intervention would be very complex and would require a different sort of study altogether, not just studies showing association, but studies showing causation. And then, of course, there would need to be intervention studies. So I would say the scientific literature as it stands is a very long way from being able to support any change in standards. So I would expect that any review of drinking water standards based on the science as I have read it now would not recommend a change in the current position.
Just one conclusion on it, if I may please, Doctor.
Yes, sir.
Can it responsibly be held that it is highly likely that the drinking water standard in respect of nitrate will be reduced because of the potential cancer effects?
No, sir, it would not. It could not be. I'd say the opposite is true. I think that there would have to be a lot more research of different types, such as research looking at and establishing causality,
yes,
and or really intervention studies, which would need to look at whether intervention made a difference. To explain that answer a bit more, I would draw the Commissioner's attention to the enormous complexity of the epidemiology of any disease, and cancer in particular, and diet. There are so many substances, particularly naturally occurring substances such as relatively simple salts like nitrates, where there will be both benefit and disbenefit from ingestion. And an hypothesis that suggests that we would be better off by reducing something is always fraught with the problem that reducing it may also cause a disbenefit. The consumption of nitrates is widespread in a normal diet, for example, occurring in leafy vegetables. part of the hypotheses, which Dr. Chambers correctly explains, is the idea that perhaps nitrates are then reduced to nitrites, of which there are more concern. That is possible, and that's not just his idea that's been raised. But again, it is a speculative hypothesis. Of course, science is built on such hypotheses, and ideas like that are always welcome. But in terms of translating them into public health regulatory measures, there are a lot more steps to take. So, in summary answer to your question, I could not conceive that it would be appropriate, given the information we've got now, to make any changes to the current practice, and I would see a local decision to set a lower level as tending to be political rather than scientific.
Dr. Black, thank you very much for your answers and for the evidence that you've provided us with. We're very grateful and good to have you assist us. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour.
We'll now move to Mr. Sanson. He's obviously provided a summary and a PowerPoint. As discussed previously, I thought, and I'm in the panel's hands entirely, of course, it might be useful if he just quickly takes you through the PowerPoint to talk to the relevant slides.
Yes, please.
Just have to sort technology for us.
Well, good morning.
Good morning and welcome.
Thank you. So I'll just be quickly running through my summary statement and talking to the slides. So I guess the first slide relates to ECAN's modelling, and in particular my participation in the groundwater expert caucusing. Mr. Neil Thomas, who will follow me, is going to expand a lot more on this, but I've just summarised some of the points from the joint witness statement, just so it's very clear, I guess, what some of the experts were signing their names to. In summary, I'm very concerned that the modelled nitrate concentrations were far higher than the measured concentrations. ECAN's groundwater model predicted higher concentrations in 22 of the 23 private water supply areas, or 96% compared to the measured concentrations. And for the community drinking water supplies, it was 11 out of 12 of them were higher. So to summarise, I don't have a lot of faith in the model, because the model concentrations do not match the measured data or, in fact, the measured trends. And just another point about the flow under the Waimakariri River, which was covered in great deal in the joint witness statement. Just to summarise that there are effectively two expert views. One that places reliance on the ECAN modelling, which is, of course, to support the view of flow under the river. And the other view was to rely on the measured data. And this concludes that the flow under the river has not been proven. Mr. Thomas will expand on that. But just to clarify that, that was my position. In terms of ECAN's solution, they're relying solely on nitrate load reductions from the farmers to achieve the outcomes. And as shown in the PowerPoint here, there are 5 nitrate sub-areas. The shape of these sub-areas is largely controlled by the groundwater flow direction. which is an imprecise science. And I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of anomalies that are shown here. One is if we look at sub-area A, which is the blue area, being directly adjacent to sub-area E, which is the purple area. And obviously this has come from the highly uncertain modelling. But logically, yeah, a farm now may be cut between the blue and the purple areas, or alternatively, it could be one farm that's right beside the neighbouring farm. So one farm is in the best area and one is in the worst area, which to my mind would be would not appear logical. And a second point that I've drawn your attention to is that the very worst sub-area, which is sub-area E, the purple zone, as shown in this figure, the receptors for that zone are in fact Cuss Main Drain and Ohoga Stream. And as discussed in the evidence of Miss Laura Drummond, the trend showed statistically significant decrease in trends in those two water bodies. So again, I guess I wonder why that becomes sub-area E, or the worst zone, when there are in fact decreasing trends in those two water bodies. Now moving on to the WRRP solution package. So there are, I guess, four main points there. The WRRP solution package does include farmer reductions, as has been discussed, but it also includes MAR and TSA and biodiversity projects and improved monitoring. We did some modelling just to look at potential volumes of water for MAR and TSA, and the modelling indicated that basically there is enough water available from the existing abstraction consents for MAR and TSA to achieve the water quality outcomes. Again, the implementation of all of these solutions requires on a strong WRRP organisation to support and fund these activities, and WRRP have asked that, I guess that, yeah, their modified table 8.9 means that the definition of the sub-areas is not required, so that all shareholders will share the pain equally.
Just go over that last sentence again, please, Mr. Sansom. I wasn't quite catching it. Perhaps I was too busy writing the word down.
Sorry. I guess the WRRP solution package relies on, well, what the solution package asks for is that you do away with the individual sub-areas,
yes,
so that all the shareholders will share the pain together, and that there'll be a strong WRRP organisation to support and fund those activities. Basically, that they can achieve more together than splitting it up as individual sub-areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, this just comes back to my earlier comments about the modelling of MAR and TSA. The orange line, which runs like a bell-shaped curve, is the average amount of water available, monthly average flow available from Will and Otahu's abstraction consents. And the various straight lines further down are the amounts of water, sort of maximum modelled amounts of water required for MAR and TSA. But must be remembered that the modelling, that was if we assume that the farmers weren't making any reductions, which of course is not what WRRP is proposing. WRRP are proposing that there will in fact be the same reductions in 2030 and 2040 if required. So that modelling was without those reductions from the farmers. So in fact, less water would be required for MAR and TSA. And that's just a summary of WRRP's modified table 8.9, which is really showing that you've gone away from the sub-areas. You're doing it all together in 2030 and 2040 if required. So in summary, the WIL solution is expected to achieve the proposed water quality targets, and we're expecting that those targets would be met quicker because the WIL solution incorporates MAR and TSA. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sansom. Any questions, Commissioner Van Broeckhuysen?
Yes, just a couple of questions. The first one arises from your paragraph 25 in your primary evidence. So, Will is asking us to consider an alternative package. When I look at your para 25 and the subcomponents there, the 4 subcomponents, it seems to me that from a regulatory perspective and in terms of providing certainty, the only one of those 4 mitigations that we could roll into PC7 to provide regulatory certainty would be the second one, the available reductions in nitrogen leaching. We can't require, through this plan change, Waimakariri Irrigation to undertake MAR and TSA. We can't require them to do localised habitat improvements, and we can't require them or anyone else to do a monitoring program. So the only one we can impose with any certainty is the second one. Do you have a response to that?
Sure, and I guess what WIL are proposing to do in terms of the farmer reductions identical to ECAN's solution for the next 20 years. So once we start collecting additional monitoring data, this should show whether further reductions are required. So I guess Will would like MAR and TSA to be written into Plan Change 7 as solution options similar to the Hines process. But I guess what we're thinking as well, current concentrations of groundwater in the catchment are generally stable. We're not seeing these huge increasing trends that the modelling seems to indicate. So if we do the exact same solution package as ECAN for the next 20 years and collect additional data and have the options of MAR and TSA, then we can actually achieve those water quality outcomes.
You know, I understand that, but do you agree that of those 4 options in your paragraph 25, the only one that we can impose through this plan change is the second one?
Well, I think that Will would be motivated to use MAR and TSA because otherwise, for future plan changes, there would presumably be further farmer reductions if, in fact, the water quality outcomes were not being met. So I think they're quite motivated to use that. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you force them to use a certain volume of MAR and TSA, but I'm instead suggesting that they would be motivated to do so.
Yeah, that wasn't my question. I'm not questioning their motivation. I'm just asking you, do you agree that of those 4 options, the only ones we can impose through this plan change are the second tranche?
Well, similar to the Hines catchment, which also includes MAR and TSA, I think similar to that would be my answer, sure.
Does the Hines, remind me, do the Hines provisions require MAR and TSA to be implemented, or do they just enable it?
I believe they just enable it.
Okay. Just a follow-up question. I understand WIL's request is to adopt the 2030 Table 8.9 N-loss reductions and then to only require the 2040 ones if water quality monitoring shows that the targets aren't being met. Given that the alternative put to us is to rely on MAR and TSA to achieve the water quality outcomes, would it be appropriate to lock in the 2040 nitrogen reductions and then only have them not occur if the MAR and TSA hasn't occurred to a level as indicated in your figure 8 and your PowerPoint slide number 4, which is a different kind of approach? You would agree with that? Okay. And just one other question at your paragraph 32. And you say in the last sentence there, you expect that for every 5 out of 10 years, there'd be 7.5 cubics of water available from R&T. So it's quite a lot of water. Does that suggest that the WIL and the NTF irrigation consents are overly generous? They've just been given too much water in the first place?
I think if we look at this figure, you can see that they're probably using most of their allocation during the main, I guess, sort of December, January, February. So that's making potentially a lot of that water available for the other months. And again, we've talked about scheme storage, and also if this water was put into the ground at other times of the year for MAR, then that's available in the system, so to speak. So no, I don't think that the abstraction consents were overly generous, as you put it.
Okay. And the reason for that being, as you just said, because they use most of their allocation during the summer, December, January, February months. That's
right.
So TSA and MAR would occur outside of that peak demand period?
Largely. You can see from the figure that there is some water available, particularly in January, February, December, I think we're talking about, but in some years potentially not. And then if you put it into the ground for MAR in particular throughout the year, I think they'll have a very positive effect potentially throughout the year, even if water wasn't available for abstraction for MAR during January, February, December.
All right, thank you very much.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions?
Yes, just one. Did your modelling include what the ecosystem and water quality will be like as a result of the wool solution?
So in terms of ecology was one of your questions?
Ecosystem.
Sure. I guess, Ms. Drummond potentially will talk about that.
So did you not take part in the modelling?
Yes, I did take part of it. This modelling was mostly to look at how much water would be available to meet the water quality outcomes. So I guess this is this in particular. I haven't commented on the ecosystems as you've put it.
So you don't know whether you're modelling the ecosystem to see what it's like as a result of the wool solution?
Ecological modelling is not my expertise.
Okay, thank you. No more questions, thanks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sensen. Thank you for your evidence and for coping with our questions.
Thank you.
And we'll now move to Mr. Thomas.
Thank you.
Who similarly there's only 2 witnesses with PowerPoint presentations, so he'll briefly talk through his presentation if the panel wants him to. Be shown.
Just to give the summary first. Yes, thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you for your evidence again. And for the PowerPoints, are you going to take us through the PowerPoints and are you going to make any preliminary remarks?
Yes, I will go through my summary statement briefly and just summarise the main points coming from that. The main points I want to go through are just covering the existing water quality in the Waimakariri zone and the modelling of future nitrate concentrations, and also discuss the low to come issue and flow under the Waimakariri River. So the slide here shows monitored nitrate concentrations in monitoring boards that are monitored by Waimakariri Irrigation, and you can see that some of them show a declining trend, some of them show a stable trend, and a few of them show a rising trend. So these concentrations don't necessarily follow with the modelling that Environment Canterbury have carried out. So their work has been based on current pathways, and it predicts future nitrate concentrations. So you wouldn't expect the current nitrate concentrations to exactly match what we see now, but you would expect the kind of general pattern to be the same. And if the high concentrations that are predicted by the model are correct, you would expect to see a kind of wide-scale increasing trend, and that's not what you see at the moment. The other point I wanted just to make at this section is to partly cover some of that. Environment Canterbury have looked at nitrate concentrations in 14 bores across the Waimak area. And these 14 bores were chosen because they are in areas which have seen relatively stable land use, so they might be expected to see concentrations which are typical of the long-term expectation, so they'll be similar to the model. But as you can see from this plot, the concentrations are quite variable. Some of them are close to the observed concentrations, some are much higher and some are much lower. So my opinion from this is that the model doesn't necessarily provide a realistic prediction of nitrate concentrations in groundwater, and I think more monitoring is required to compare the projected model results to the observed data, and I think the monitoring needs to feed back into the model to actually confirm its projections or not. And I'll just turn to the flow under the Waimak River. So there are a couple of points to raise here, and the first one is just around the joint witness statement. And all the experts at the end of the joint witness statement agreed that there was potential for groundwater flow beneath the Waimak River. But I think it's quite important to emphasise the word potential. In my opinion, that the balance of actual observed data suggests that the groundwater flow is unlikely, but it is a possibility. I don't think it is something that's actually likely to occur at the moment. And the figure that I'm showing up on the screen at the moment shows groundwater levels in one of the 50-metre deep monitoring bores installed by Environment Canterbury about 5 kilometres west of Christchurch. And as you can see, the yellow line shows flows in the Waimak River, and the blue line shows groundwater levels. And as flows in the Waimak River increase, so do groundwater levels, which suggests there is a hydraulic connection between deep groundwater and the flows in the Waimak River. And that suggests in turn that the river does provide a boundary to groundwater flow, because there is seepage from the river coming down to deep levels. There isn't data going down much deeper, so there are deeper bores at the same location as this shallow bore, and they show a similar but more muted effect. And the other point I just want to discuss here is groundwater flow directions. So these are the 3 bores I was just discussing. And one's located on the north side of the river and 2 are on the south side of the river. And if you plot the groundwater flow directions from the deepest 3 bores, they show a groundwater flow direction that is east-northeast or east. Those are the green lines shown in the plots here. And in comparison, the groundwater levels from the ECAN modelling are shown by the red line. And the ECAN groundwater model doesn't accurately represent the groundwater levels in those 3 bores. In which case, my opinion is that the groundwater model may not accurately reflect the overall groundwater flow directions. So the flow under the river may be an artefact from the modelling. And the last point I just wanted to highlight from the joint witness statement is that the experts all agreed at the end is that the model review process certainly hasn't been sufficiently documented. And there's not a high level of confidence in the model results. That's the end of my presentation, so I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you for that. Questions, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No questions from me, thanks.
And no questions from me either, Mr. Thomas. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the explanation.
Thank you. So we now turn to Ms. Drummond, who doesn't have a presentation, so I'm assuming the panel will just move straight to questions, if there are any.
Good morning, Ms. Drummond. Thank you for coming in and thank you for giving us the summary statement and your evidence as well. We're grateful to you for that. There's no corrections or updating that you want to do before we go to questions?
Not since my summary statement, no.
No. Very well. Thank you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Ms. Drummond?
Yeah, just a couple from your primary evidence.
Sure.
Paras 27 and 28. And forgive me if you've addressed this in your summary statement, but the MPSFM 2020 now has different nitrogen toxicity bottom lines, annual medium of 2.4 and the 95th percentile of 3.5. Has that changed the conclusions in your evidence in any way?
Not materially. I mean, the new MPS has come in with tighter restrictions. The WIL approach is to reduce the nitrate concentrations in the streams. We fully accept they need to be reduced. And the proposal is to reduce those over time.
Paragraph 43.
Yes.
You say there such high nitrogen reductions or such high reductions in nitrogen loading are unsupported. Is that in terms of effects on shallow groundwater and spring flows, etc., in the Waimakariri area? Or is that conclusion also have regard to Christchurch City's concerns regarding their deep groundwater?
No, I'm not considering the Christchurch supply.
Just the local
no.
issues?
In 43 we're talking about sub-area E receptors.
Yeah.
Yes.
And a similar question at forward paragraph 47 regarding your references there to the old MPSFM. Has the new MPSFM changed your conclusions in any way?
Using the MAR as I have in paragraph 47, you can see where that they would reduce to. Only one of those, the Ohoka, would reduce to under the new MPS bottom line. The point I was trying to make with that paragraph is that just the MAR would reduce those sites by that much. I'm not also considering the nitrate reductions or the on-farm improvements as well. So when we include those as well, there is more options to get to those national bottom lines over time.
Okay, and paragraph 57. You say there that use of MAR would reduce the risk of increased sediment output as filtration through the level gravels would remove suspended sediments. I was aware that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council decades ago had an artificial recharge system at Royds Hill. They had to abandon that because it clogged up with sediment because they were taking high flows in the manner that you suggest here. Would that same risk occur here, that the recharge areas or the MAR areas could clog up due to the suspended sediment that they'd be capturing?
There is potential if you take very sediment-laden water from the Waimakariri. My understanding of the WIL scheme is they don't take that water.
Okay.
And we would design the infiltration system so that it could handle the water that it was being given.
And I guess if the MAR was fed from, was it the Wright Road Dam, then of course any suspended sediment would have settled out in that dam anyway.
Exactly. An assessment could be made as to how to minimise any chance of sediment entering the waterways. That would be a high priority.
All right, thank you. That's all I wanted to ask you about.
Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon.
Yes, I've got a couple of questions for Ms Drummond. In your evidence summary, paragraph 3, you note elevated nutrients, sediment input, fecal contamination, lack of riparian vegetation, fish barrier as issues facing Kaiapoi rivers. And then in your paragraph 5, you say that in your view, monitoring does not show an upward trend in nitrate concentrations in the same rivers, but rather in isolated hotspots such as Silver Stream, as a reason why the focus on surface water mitigation measures should be enabled. If MAR is installed for Silver Stream, with regard to water quality, will it benefit other Kaiapoi rivers?
If we do MAR at Silver Stream only, for example, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
So that would dilute the nutrients in Silver Stream, which would flow on down through to the Kaiapoi River and the ultimate receiving environments, yes. The point I was making with 3 is that there are also other initiatives that we need to do to improve the health of the streams.
I read those other initiatives, but I just wanted to make sure that what MAR in the Silver Stream was what rivers they would affect, but you've answered that, so thank you.
No problem.
Regard to water quantity, the Tipper report advocates for particular minimum flows to be raised in the Kaiapoi rivers. Will installing a MAR in Silver Stream benefit those other rivers, Cam, the Aohaka Stream, Courtney Stream, for instance, and will it raise their minimum flows? I'm not sure of the hydrology of the area, so which is the point of my question.
Yeah, sorry, that's not my area of expertise, the hydrology.
Not the person to ask.
Yeah, of how the water would be moved through the aquifers.
Okay, thank you. And then in your evidence summary at paragraph 8, you talk about a greater awareness that compels farmers to undertake environmental measures to better manage and minimise their nutrients. But we've also read that some farmers don't believe the science and don't believe that environmental measures make a difference, particularly when the overseer results don't show it. How does WIL navigate and resolve this issue between their farmers?
That's probably a good question for Paul Rees, to be honest.
Okay, I'll ask that of him as well. And back to my question that I asked Mr. Sanson, I think it was, has any modelling been undertaken by WIL about what the ecosystem will be like as a result of the WIL solution?
Not per se the way that you're asking. I understood your question for Mr. Sanson. In his evidence, there is a table, figure 7, which has the TSA mixing calculation results.
Okay. I'll take a look at that again.
Yes. If you take a look at that, keeping in mind my paragraphs 10 and 11 in my summary. Oh, sorry, actually, let me just make sure I've got the right paragraphs. So 34 Oh, no, sorry, it's too many paragraphs. So 46 and 47, the ones that Commissioner was asking me previously.
And your EIC?
Yes, where we talk about the expert science panel predicting the change with MAR, where we talked about 50% reduction potentially for Ohoka and Cust and a 20 to 25 for Silver Stream. When I consider those with ecosystem health, it is having a really positive effect on ecosystem health in those streams.
Okay, thank you. And then at your paragraph 41 in your EIC, and I'll just bring it up, you talk about...
Say 41, sorry?
41.
Yes.
And I'll just go there myself. I'm getting there. Management of new nitrate issues in these waterways should be based on current monitoring data and trends. Was the Kriegler and Etheridge report not based on the current monitoring trends?
It is, but my interpretation of, well, my point from that paragraph is that as time goes on and we make these improvements that we are proposing, we need detailed, widespread monitoring of the area to understand where the improvements are happening and where they're not happening, so we can target the response and get the desired outcome.
Thank you. And if Forest and Bird say in their paragraph 48 to 57 that when planning for augmentation within the vicinity of a wetland, the planning documents clearly set out how the wetland will be preserved and protected from potential adverse effects of the augmentation development, and monitor the effects on the wetland and groundwater fauna species abundance downstream. Would that be something that will do as a matter of course?
If there is a wetland in the vicinity of the MAR infiltration area, I would be my understanding that we would be happy to do that.
And just one more. Your paragraph 65 talks about a fish screen, I think it's at Brown Rock.
63, did you say?
65.
65. Yes, Browns Rock intake.
So we heard earlier in the hearing, or during an earlier week of a hearing, that fish screens generally are not as ideal as they should be. And I'm glad to see you're monitoring the effects. Does monitoring show how effective the fish screen is?
That is the intention of the monitoring program.
Okay.
We're currently at the beginning. The consent does not run out until 2035, I believe, for that. But we are, at the moment, designing how we will put the nets in to test if fish are getting in. So we are at the start of the phase of working that out.
Okay. Thank you. That's all from me.
Sorry, Ms. Drummond, can we go back to your paragraph 10 in your evidence and check, please?
Sure.
I think you referred there to a reduction in farming nitrogen load in some areas will contribute to that improvement. Which areas do you have in mind in saying in some areas?
I'm referring to the areas that will feed the watercourses that have elevated nitrates. So in particular Silver Stream, Cust River, Cust Main Drain, and the Ohoka.
You? Now, I wanted to ask you also about something in paragraph 46, please.
Yes.
So I'm not quite clear, what would be the sources of the dilution water?
The source of the MAR water that we're proposing?
You referred to water for dilution. I think that's the same thing as MAR, isn't it?
Yes, sorry, the Waimakariri River.
So would using water from the river for dilution diminish the health and well-being of the river itself as a water body and its ecosystems?
Of the Waimakariri River?
Yes, wherever the source
Yes.
is.
Yes, no, just to be clear. That water is already allocated for in Will and Ngaitahu's water take, so we don't consider it would have any further adverse effect than the water take consent.
So are you taking under Ngaitahu's water consent, or is it in addition to that?
No, my understanding it is under Will's consent, existing consent.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Yes, thank you, Mr. Williams.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for another one, haven't we?
Yeah, so almost there. So Mr. Ford, I've got next on my list. If that works with you.
Splendid.
Will be very familiar to you. So.
Yes, of course.
So similarly, not proposing any summary, move straight to questions should the panel have any.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ford.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for coming in to see us again.
It's a pleasure, as always.
We have your summary as well as your original evidence. Any corrections or updatings that you'd like to propose to us?
No, I haven't got any.
All right, well, if you're agreeable, we'll go straight to questions then.
Okay.
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, thank you. Just initially at your evidence in chief, page 6, table 1. And the dairy line has the NLOS going up from the actual to the 2020 target. And my question is, firstly, is just can you remind us why it does that? And secondly, that would not actually happen in real life, would it?
Yeah, okay. So what it's is indicating is the actual farm loss in 2015-18 is significantly lower, but the target is 82 at 2020. So if you look above that, all land uses is 62 and 62. So there's no need for the dairy land to increase up to the 82. The reductions are being made in the other three land uses who have quite severe reductions in terms of achieving GMP. So it's best to look at the all land uses at the top. And there's no change, but what's effectively happening below that is that the dairy's staying the same because under the planning document they can't go above where they are anyway, and the other three have got quite significant reductions to meet GMP. So that's an internal management issue within Will.
So the dairy, in terms of my second question, in real life they won't be increasing their average leaching from 67 up to 82 across the command area?
No, they won't.
So why didn't you use, in terms of the reductions in 2030, 2040 and 2050, why didn't you use the actual then as a starting point rather than a hypothetical not going to occur 82?
Yeah, I guess this is showing the impact on the individual land uses and underneath what WIL are contracted to do under their consent. So it's just explaining how it's being managed within WIL rather than saying what's actually going to happen. Does that answer your question?
Not really. So the actual dairy loss is 67. We've agreed they're not actually going to go up to 82. That's some kind of theoretical construct. So I'm still not understanding why for your 2030, 2040 and 2050 percentage reductions you've used 82 as the starting point when that's actually not going to happen.
Well, I think it's again looking at the change from GMP to 2030 for all land uses and looking at that, what would have to happen because the target GMP has got to be reduced by 15% for the dairy and less for the other three.
The fact that they're actually not going to get to 82, sorry to labour this, but I'm simply not understanding your analysis. Does that affect your conclusions at all, that the 82 is just a hypothetical figure?
Yes, it is. Yes, it doesn't affect my conclusions.
Does not affect your conclusions, yeah, okay. All right, and just at your para 42, can you just remind us, or me in particular, the difference between cash operating surplus and net cash position?
Okay, the cash operating surplus is the gross farm revenue minus the farm operating expenses. The net cash position has additional measures taken out of the cash operating surplus, and those are, where are they? I've got them in there somewhere. Yeah, it's interest, tax and drawings taken off the cash farm surplus, cash operating surplus, to get the net cash position. So I explain it in paragraph 32.
Okay. So in terms of how a layperson or a farmer on the ground might view the impacts potentially of PC7, would the net cash position be a figure they'd be more inclined to refer to?
Yes, I think so, because that incorporates the cost of debt.
Yeah.
And other things, so that would be what they would look at in terms of the impact.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No questions from me, thank you.
Mr. Ford, you've referred to significant changes in farm management needed to meet intermediate term nitrate loss requirements. Would a farmer buying or converting to dairy in the last decade or two be entitled or have been entitled to assume that there would be no need for significant changes to move to more sustainable practice?
I think my answer hinges on what your definition of significant is. I think in the WIL area particularly, if you look at the results of the monitoring and, you know, the WIL scheme has been in action for 20 years now, and there was quite a considerable amount of dairy conversion at the beginning of it. you would have expected, if there was significant impact on water from nitrogen, that they would have been seeing significant increases now. So I think it would be fair to say that they would expect to reduce the amount of nitrogen in the water, as is proposed by Will, but not that it be of a significant amount. Because the monitoring data doesn't indicate that a significant amount of change is necessary.
And would they have been able to anticipate that?
Anticipate what, sorry?
That it would not be of a significant amount?
I think so, yes.
How would they have done that? Until your actual monitoring is done, how can you tell that that would be the outcome?
I'm talking about the monitoring that's been done to date, which is presented to you by the two people from PDP.
Yes. But at the time when they were making their decisions to buy or to convert, wouldn't they have, well, they certainly wouldn't have known exactly what the modelling now produces or shows.
No, they wouldn't have. They wouldn't have at that point.
Does.
Sorry, what's your second point?
They wouldn't have been able to tell what the monitoring would show.
No, that they wouldn't have, depending on how long ago they did the conversion.
So would they make an appropriate provision in their doing due diligence or in their construction of their business plans against some uncertainty about the impact?
I think it comes back to your earlier definition of it being a significant. I think it would have been appropriate for them to be aware that there would be requirement for some reduce of nitrogen, but not a significant amount.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ford.
Thank you.
Looks like it's best to take the lunch break now, does it, Mr. Williams?
Yeah, if you're happy to, Sarah, we've obviously got
Yes,
two witnesses to get through, so if I'm in your hands, but if you want to take the lunch break, that's absolutely fine with us. So.
Yes. Well, I think we should do that. We'll adjourn now and resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.